This is 1968, the year of the woman.
The New York Times said in January 1969 that 1968 may well go down in history as the year of the woman. Indeed, it was the year when the women's liberation movement burst onto the national stage, and the year when women broke new ground in the world of politics and government. It was the year women led the way in the civil rights movement, and the year women achieved firsts in employment and education. And it was the year that women saw combat up close and personal, from the field hospitals to the front lines in Vietnam. Over the next hour, we'll look back on the women who in 1968 changed the course of history.
Join us now! Sisterhood is powerful! Join us now!
I felt that we weren't getting our fair share of opportunity, but did nothing about it because there was no one to do anything with.
I was supposed to believe that women weren't interested in politics or government. I didn't believe that. I from the beginning, thought women were interested. It's just that there was no opportunity.
When I first heard about these women who were organizing, I was thrilled.
It all started with a suburban mother of three named Betty Friedan.
The women's movement, I mean, that's real. You know, that's real, and that's lasted.
In 1968, the women's movement was in its infancy. It had been just 2 years since Friedan had founded the National Organization for Women, or NOW. But she had shaken American society to its core in 1963 with a feminine mystique. Friedan was a freelance writer, a graduate of Smith College, and in the book, she had boldly challenged what was, in the post-war era, an idealized image of the happy housewife. Friedan called the sense of dissatisfaction and repression felt by many homemakers the problem that has no name.
It was written as a result of her canvassing her classmates at Smith, and they all agreed that what do I do now? I have this degree from Smith. I want to do something more, but there's not a place for women.
Friedan hit a nerve. By 1964, The Feminine Mystique had become the best-selling nonfiction book in the country. But there was little at the time that Friedan's followers could do about solving the problem. Until, that is, President Lyndon Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act. While the landmark legislation ended racial segregation in public places, it also, under Title VII of the Act, banned discrimination in employment on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex.
Was something that was very, very significant. And the only reason we had the law on our side is because a couple of women in Congress, a Democrat in the House of Representatives and a Republican in the Senate, insisted on inserting the word sex into the Civil Rights Bill of 1964.
The bill also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to implement the law.
The EOC was very important from the moment it was created. Here was a commission that said, essentially anywhere in America, if you feel you have been discriminated against because of your race, national origin, your religion, and yes, your gender, then you may come here.
In the early days, though, the EEOC did very little to end sex discrimination in the workplace. Then, in June 1966, Friedan and others had attended the National Conference of State Commissions on the Status of Women in Washington. They had started talking to each other about their frustration with the EEOC and its failure to enforce Title VII of the Civil Rights Act as it applied to women.
They go out to dinner and they talked about the women needed an NAACP for women, and Friedan wrote on a napkin, as the story goes, NOW, National Organization for Women.
Friedan had immediately recruited some of the best and the brightest women she knew.
Betty contacted me that summer and asked if I would do the public relations,
And we worked all summer to get new people involved. And at the end of October 1966 in Washington, in the basement of the Washington Post, we had our first national conference for NOW. There were about 35 people in the room, and we all decided we'd each work on what made us angriest. One of the most important issues from the very beginning was help wanted ads. Help wanted ads used to say help wanted male, help wanted female. We worked very hard to get the help wanted ads, what we called desexagrated. We met with the newspapers, we picketed, we marched, we directed lawsuits against the EEOC to make sure they enforced it.
By November 1967, when NOW held its second conference, it had expanded its goals. And Friedan had proposed a Bill of Rights for women, demanding in Article 1 that Congress pass the long-delayed Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution.
52 words. Equality of rights shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex.
The Bill of Rights also included demands that the EEOC enforce the ban against sex discrimination in employment, that women retain the right to return to work after childbirth, that working parents be allowed to deduct child care expenses, that public daycare centers be established by law, that women have equal opportunities at all levels of education, that women in poverty receive the same job training and benefits as men, and that women have the right to control their own reproductive lives.
The Bill of Rights was our call to action. These were the issues we were going to continue to fight for, and to fight for, in some ways, in new issues. And so we began working our people around the country to work for this.
And in January 1968, NOW issued its newly minted Bill of Rights to the public, and the movement took off.
NOW established chapters in all 50 states and in big cities and little towns. That was its strength. Women and men who, it was like a religion for them. They worked so hard, they sacrificed their jobs, their health, their marriages for this cause. We had at least 2,200 who worked very hard, and that's why NOW really got results very, very fast.
Later that year, NOW lobbied Johnson to amend his 1965 executive order mandating federal contractors to take affirmative action in hiring minorities so that it included women.
So that brought millions of women into the pipeline. We also pressed for women to be included in Title II, which prevented discrimination in public accommodations. This meant not only restaurants and bars, but it meant the airlines, the buses. Women could be excluded anywhere.
By 1970, NOW had tens of thousands of active members.
The coalition that we have found in action, the unprecedented solidarity that women are showing today, this will continue as a political coalition to achieve the unfinished revolution, to win the unfinished revolution of women's equality.
Over the years, NOW has been instrumental in advocating on behalf of women's rights, and it has been at the forefront of efforts to combat both sexual harassment and domestic violence. Coming up, a younger generation of females fights for equality when our look back at the women of 1968 continues.
It's just in the air now. It's happening much faster than I ever thought it would. It's a political movement, it's a social movement. All this is springing up of itself.
Gloria Steinem had become one of the most prominent figures in the women's movement by 1968. While Betty Friedan had been publishing The Feminine Mystique in 1963, Steinem, also a freelance journalist and a Smith grad, had been working undercover as a Playboy bunny. Her two-part feature in Show magazine titled A Bunny's Tale, exposed how the Playboy Club exploited the bunnies and gained Steinem widespread acclaim. In 1968, Steinem helped to found New York Magazine, expressing her feminist views in essays like After Black Power, Women's Liberation.
Her mission was to get more women to understand that they had to work together and have legislation that would change their lives. They weren't going to get it by being dissatisfied and angry. And so she wanted political power. I thought she was enormously critical. And I think that she gave up a great deal of personal gratification to continue her work.
Unlike Betty Friedan, who was a married mother of 3, Steinem vowed early on not to marry. Steinem effectively bridged the gap between now and more radical organizations, the most notable being New York Radical Women, founded by a group of young feminists.
We called ourselves radical women because radical actually means getting to the root of things, and radical was a very positive term that was used a lot in the movements of the 60s. We wanted to get to the root of the oppression of women, and we wanted to build a mass movement similar to the civil rights movement and similar to the movement against the war in Vietnam.
Many of New York Radical Women's members had in fact become radicalized in the mid-60s after going south to work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which formed in 1960 to give younger Black Americans a larger voice in the civil rights movement. These women wanted to give their movement a younger voice, with an emphasis on self-reliance.
We tried to portray ourselves that we were going to be the SNCC of the new feminist movement, and now was the NAACP of the new feminist movement. We were going to be the daring-do frontline activists.
Sarah Child herself coined the phrase, "Sisterhood is powerful," that year.
We felt if we were going to organize a mass movement of women, we had to raise women's consciousness.
And that is precisely what they set out to do, when hundreds of women joined a protest organized by New York Radical Women at the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City on September 7, 1968, picketing the pageant on the boardwalk outside the convention center.
They were calling into question the whole myth of beauty and how women were supposed to behave in just one way.
We threw these instruments of female torture, high heels, girdles, women's magazines that portrayed women as sex objects, Playboy magazine, all those things into this freedom trash can.
They did not, however, burn their bras, a myth that was created by a female reporter who likened the feminist protesters to the male draft card burning anti-war protesters. Some of them, though, bought pageant tickets, smuggling in a women's liberation banner and unfurling it from the balcony during the finale.
That action made women's liberation a household term. Women's lib began to spread everywhere.
Still, there were ideological differences among the radical feminists, and in January 1969, New York Radical Women splintered into different factions. As for Gloria Steinem, she would become one of the founders of the National Women's Political Caucus and launch Ms. Magazine, a pioneering publication by women for women.
I remember a piece, and it might have been the first issue of Ms., about the click of recognition, where women around the country would hear something so condescending, so demeaning, maybe out of their own husbands' mouths, not in my case, but in many, that they suddenly had this moment of, wait a minute, that's what feminism is talking about. That's the deal. And that's what we have to fight against.
Coming up, women reach new heights of power in the government and politics when our look back at 1968 continues.
After the '68 convention, the Women's Political Caucus was founded. We all had a little saying, 6% is not enough, which meant the number of women in the legislature, the number of women in Congress.
And the number of women in appointed offices. So the caucus dedicated itself to training and supporting women for these jobs. 2 major jobs in the federal government did in fact go to women in 1968. At the State Department, Miriam Camps became the first woman to be vice chairman of the Policy Planning Council, established after World War II to help plan America's long-term foreign policy. And West Virginia lawyer Virginia May Brown became the first female to head an independent administrative agency when President Lyndon Johnson appointed her chairman of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Meanwhile, over at another independent government agency, NASA, in 1968, 25-year-old Poppy Northcutt became the first woman ever to work in mission control.
When I finished college, I had a math degree. I looked for a job. I came out of school at an unusual time, so I was looking for a job, and NASA was hiring, and contractors at NASA were hiring.
Not necessarily hiring women, but
they were hiring tech aides. They were hiring people that had math degrees like me.
Northcutt started out as a computerist before being promoted to engineer in preparation for the launch of Apollo 8, the first manned spacecraft to orbit the moon.
I was the return to Earth specialist on Apollo. The program that I worked on was the development of the return to Earth capability. It started off called an abort program. As things developed over the years, it became the program that was used not just for aborts, but for any kind of returns. So my specialty was whenever they were getting close to the moon. That was the whole goal for the whole program, get them back alive.
And they did, on December 27, 1968, paving the way for every mission that followed.
Because there were so many important things that were done in that particular mission. There was everything except the actual landing was done during that mission, and there were a lot of new things to be done. For us, for what I was working on, it was the most challenging mission of all.
Remember reading about the first black woman elected to the United States Congress? This is me, Shirley Chisholm. I'm Shirley Chisholm, Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman in this country to have been elected to the Congress.
Indeed, in November 1968, Democrat Shirley Chisholm broke through to the corridors of power. Running on the slogan, "Unbought and Unbossed," Chisholm defeated Republican opponent James Farmer, a prominent civil rights leader who had helped found the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE.
Shirley Chisholm was remarkable because she was the first African American to pointedly speak out about her role as a woman and not only as an African American. When she ran for Congress in New York, people made fun of the fact that she was running. It was such a men's club, and I mean a black men's club, that they were sure they could beat her. And one of the reasons they were sure they could beat her was that she often spoke about her role as a woman, and they thought that would really condemn her. Little did they know, women vote in larger numbers than men.
Chisholm, who trained as a school teacher, had served 2 terms in the New York State Legislature before winning the seat for the newly created district in Brooklyn, where she was born and raised. She would be the only female in the freshman class of the 91st Congress, but she hired an all-female staff and was a force to be reckoned with, working to promote civil rights and women's rights, and speaking out against the war in Vietnam, as well as President Richard Nixon's economic policies.
Shirley Chisholm was a remarkable member of Congress in many ways. The fact that she was black and came from a northern state was something that was highly unusual and very significant. And the fact that she spoke her mind and spoke it eloquently and forcefully was also something that everybody had to pay attention to.
And Chisholm paved the way for other women who set their sights on Capitol Hill.
There's no question that her success was pivotal to the success of women like me and women who came after her. She had, simply by her election, a consciousness-raising effect on women who might then consider politics as possible for them.
Chisholm would take it even further in 1972 when she announced she was running for president.
Why is it that it has to always be white males, white males, white males, white males, white males?
While Chisholm would not succeed that year, her question clearly resonated with American voters in the 21st century. Coming up, women power ahead in the civil rights movement when our look back at the women of 1968 continues.
Until 1968, the civil rights movement was led primarily by men. But that year, some women assumed positions of power in the major civil rights organizations of the day, and other females helped to advance the cause in their own unique ways.
While we must condemn any form of violence, including physical violence, we must also condemn racism, deprivation, and poverty, which are forms of violence that are often root causes of physical violence.
Coretta Scott King had worked alongside her husband, civil rights leader Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., for more than a decade by 1968.
When he was assassinated, the public gravitated to looking at her and to hearing from her and to understanding something very important, that activist men often have activist wives, and they often are the equivalent in intelligence and in understanding of the world around them.
He would have wanted me to be here.
Mrs. King stepped in to pick up right where her husband had left off. Just 4 days after Dr. King's assassination, she led a silent march through Memphis, demanding justice for striking sanitation workers whose cause had brought him to the city. And on April 27th, she stood in for King at an anti-Vietnam War rally in New York City. The next month, Mrs. King helped launch what was his plan for a poor people's campaign, leading thousands of women in a march on Washington on May 12, 1968, Mother's Day. Tens of thousands of people later joined them, building a makeshift camp, Resurrection City, on the Mall, and marching to the Capitol to demand jobs, unemployment insurance, a fair minimum wage, and education. In late 1968, Mrs. King founded the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta. She also started what would be a 15-year campaign to establish a federal holiday in honor of her late husband, to be held around the time of Dr. King's birthday on January 15th.
The passage of this bill with strong bipartisan support has brought us much closer to the realization of Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream.
All power to the people!
Meanwhile, in California in 1968, another activist wife was making her voice heard on behalf of the growing Black Power movement.
So it was a social platform to gain, through political action, goals that would essentially enable African American people at that point to be functioning as full-fledged citizens.
Cleaver, who had married Black Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver in December 1967, was the first woman to hold a position in the party's leadership.
I would write out press releases and announce that there was going to be a demonstration, or announce there was going to be a press conference, or announce anything that went out to the press.
At the time, Black Panther founder Huey Newton was in jail, having been arrested the previous year for allegedly killing a police officer at a traffic stop.
All power to the people is becoming a reality because the people have come out here to stand for hours, to stand if necessary for days in front of these pig-coed buildings to demand that Huey P. Newton be set free.
Cleaver continued to organize rallies on Newton's behalf and helped the Black Panthers to gain an international following.
What we saw ourselves as being part of was a revolutionary struggle that was going on around the world. A revolution against imperialism, a revolution against racism, a revolution to transform the way people lived.
Other Black women in America played their own role in that revolution, including one who told the world that she wasn't going to take it anymore. Aretha Franklin's version of Otis Redding's 1965 single, Respect, quickly became an anthem in the fight against both racial and gender inequality.
It was about male-female relationships more than anything else. But yes, it was picked up by the civil rights movement as a mantra and a battle cry.
And in February 1968, the same month Franklin won her first Grammy Award, Martin Luther King Jr. gave her the SCLC Drumbeat Award for Musicians. In June 1968, Franklin appeared on the cover of Time magazine, honored as the Queen of Soul. Gracing the cover of another magazine that year, Ladies' Home Journal, was model Naomi Sims, the first Black woman to appear on the front of a major women's magazine.
That was brilliantly significant because up until then, people were afraid that people wouldn't buy the magazine. There was a Black person, but it was the exact opposite. Everybody bought it, and we loved it. Naomi Sims was such a beauty, such an elegant, regal person. She opened many doors.
The first Miss Black America is Sandra Williams.
The first Miss Black America pageant was held on September 7th, 1968, at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlantic City, just blocks from where the traditional pageant was held. It had been organized by an activist named Philip Savage with the help of the NAACP.
There are some people who feel that the Miss America contest is superfluous and commercial and couldn't care less about it.
There was a specific need to display, applaud, and parade Black beauty. We felt that for too long in America, the Black woman's beauty has been ignored, disrespected, and not recognized.
The Miss Black America pageant timed the show to begin at midnight, shortly after the Miss America pageant ended, allowing the media to cover both events. Then there was Dr. Dorothy Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, who in April 1968 was the only female civil rights leader summoned to the White House after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed.
We had to ask ourselves, how do we make sure this is not in vain? How do we keep the movement going? How do we make sure that it's understood they might have killed the dreamer, but not the dream?
A dream that was indeed kept alive by women like Height and has continued to be propelled forward by legions of women since. Coming up, women break down barriers in employment and education when our look back at 1968 continues. Women were standing up to power across politics and making their voices heard in public institutions, and that empowerment fervor spread quickly from policy to the private sector.
This working jet set, who breakfast in New York and lunch in Phoenix, insist on the same comfort, safety, economy, and style in their personal travel.
They were also among the very first working women to file charges of sex discrimination with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission after its establishment in 1964. The National Stewardesses Union, the ALSSA, challenged the industry-wide policies of hiring only single women and terminating them upon marriage, as well as retiring them from passenger service upon turning 32, or at most 35.
Frankly, this was really mostly because the airlines wanted to save money on insurance vetting. But they said it was a matter of sex appeal.
The union prevailed, though, in 1968, when the EEOC issued 3 individual rulings that effectively ended age and marital restrictions on stewardesses' employment. The victory over the airlines set the stage for future triumphs in other industries.
It was incredibly difficult for women to get jobs in broadcasting and in journalism as a whole. In broadcasting, it was particularly difficult because you had people tell you that women's voices were not authoritative enough to deliver the news. Also, the men who were doing the hiring, and they were all men, had no notion that the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 said that it was illegal to discriminate against women in the workplace. That was brand new information to them, and it took some very brave women to file suit at CBS News and at Newsweek and at the New York Times to really make it possible for women to get into journalism.
Another glass ceiling was shattered when stockbroker Muriel Siebert became the first female to occupy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange.
Mickey was complaining that all these different firms she'd worked for, she just said, you know, I don't feel like I'm in charge. And to be in charge, you need to have a seat.
But it would be easier said than done. Siebert needed a sponsor and had asked several male colleagues before one had finally agreed. She had also needed a bank to help with financing.
First of all, she paid more for the seat than anybody else had paid, over $400,000. She went to 9 people to get the funding. Finally, Chase Bank agreed to do that.
It had taken 2 years for Siebert to finally be elected to the exchange on December 28, 1967.
Ms. Siebert, do you feel a little lonely being the only distaff member of a basically male financial community?
No, I used to feel a little lonely, and I used to feel quite outnumbered. But in recent years, there are more and more women who are gaining a pretty good stature down on Wall Street.
Siebert went on to found her own firm, becoming the first woman to own and operate a brokerage company that was a member of the New York Stock Exchange.
I battered down a few walls or pushed a few doors open, as I like to say. If the doors didn't open, I just reared back and pushed them open.
It changed the dynamics. It changed, quite frankly, the floor in terms of how projects were going forward, how funding was going, and her trust level. I think it's extremely important that Mickey, to this day, even after she's passed away, has such loyalty and such trust with the name Muriel Siebert.
Gender parity also began to be a topic of conversation in academia. The Women's Equity Action League was founded in 1968 as a spin-off of NOW by members who didn't want to deal with the issue of abortion.
The Women's Equity Action League was very important, actually. It doesn't exist now, but during their time, they sued medical schools and law schools for equal admissions for women. We started challenging the fact that there were quotas against women in medical school and law school.
At the faculty level, sociology professor Dr. Suzanne Keller became the first woman to be granted tenure in Princeton University's 222-year history. In fact, there was nothing short of a revolution at all-male Ivy League schools that year.
The real trigger here is admissions, because what starts to happen in the late 1960s is that the high school students at these schools called the best boys began to show that they no longer wanted to go to school without girls. And so the hegemony that places like Princeton and Yale had in claiming their share of the best boys was threatened.
So in 1967, both institutions had begun studying the feasibility of opening their gates to women. Much to the chagrin of many old-time alumni.
These alumni were fiercely resistant to sharing their undergraduate institutions with women. A Princeton alumnus said that if Princeton University were to admit women, Princeton would be lost forever. A Yale alumnus said if you brought women here and you had to associate with them each and every day, it would be a terrible bore.
But in the fall of 1968, the trustees and faculty of Yale, being more forward-thinking, voted to go co-ed the following year. That prompted Princeton to vote for it as well. And in the fall of 1969, the first female undergrads arrived on campus.
I'm just thrilled. Couldn't be any more thrilled. It's like making history. I'm a pioneer.
A pioneer indeed. Today, about half of all students at Ivy League schools are female, and women comprise more than 56% of students on campuses nationwide. Coming up, women go to war, landing on the battlefields of Vietnam, when our look back at 1968 continues. "1968 was the deadliest year of the Vietnam War for America and its allies, largely as a result of the Tet Offensive, launched by the North Vietnamese on January 30th. It was a coordinated series of attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam, including the U.S. Air Force Base at Da Nang. A medical support plane that landed there to evacuate the wounded came under heavy fire, but Air Force nurse Jane Lombardi helped to load 38 patients, 26 of whom couldn't walk, on board. Her actions won First Lieutenant Lombardi the Bronze Star, the first combat decoration ever awarded to a woman. Lombardi was one of approximately 6,000 military nurses, all volunteers, who served in Vietnam. So was Diane Evans, who arrived on August 1st, 1968.
I don't think you ever forget your first impression of flying into a war zone. But nothing prepares you for war but war itself. I wasn't prepared for the smell, and I wasn't prepared for the sounds.
Or for the constant influx of military aircraft transporting the wounded.
Initially, we were horrified by the mass numbers of horrific casualties of every gruesome kind that you can imagine. But pretty soon, I mean, when you've got 65 patients, you have to take care of these 65 patients by making sure that their wounds are irrigated, they're dressed, that they're given their antibiotics, that they're getting their blood, their IVs. You can imagine. You forget about yourself. Your job is to take care of them.
And in addition to saving lives, that meant giving them hope.
What they have told us is we were their angels. When they came into the hospital and they saw us women, they thought they were safe. Well, they weren't, but they felt safe because they were in a hospital and they were with us.
Yet the contribution those nurses made didn't receive recognition back home, especially as support for the war tumbled.
We came home to a country in 1969 that didn't want to hear what we had done in Vietnam. Now they were taking the war out on the veterans, the soldiers, which was very painful and very difficult to understand.
But by 1982, there would be a Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall honoring those who lost their lives or went missing in Vietnam. Among them, the 8 military nurses who died while serving in the war. And by 1984, there would be a bronze statue, the 3 soldiers, honoring the men who came home.
What about the women? They forgot us. They don't even know we were there.
That was what went through Diane Evans' mind that day, and she was determined to do something about it. It would take nearly 10 years, but
let's dig.
In July 1993, Evans helped to break ground for the first ever national monument to American women at war. The bronze statue depicts 3 women and a wounded soldier.
As I look at the monument, of course I see myself. I'm that nurse tending to that wounded soldier. Being an Army nurse in Vietnam was the greatest privilege of my life. I would do it all over again. It was a privilege to take care of those young men.
Urata Kazikis, who in 1968 was one of just a few female reporters in Vietnam, also says she would do it all over again.
Well, I was earning $60 a week at Look magazine at that time. My parents said, absolutely not. This is a crazy thing for you to do. So I went on a quiz show called Password, and Jim Backus was my celebrity partner, and I won $500, and I bought a one-way ticket to Saigon.
Once she arrived, Kazikis obtained a press pass that allowed her to travel to the front lines, where being a woman proved to be a mixed bag.
The advantages was that I think you could really get the soldiers to open up to you, and I wasn't afraid to ask them really questions about their level of fear, being homesick, you know, how it really felt to be there in the jungle with somebody trying to kill you. And the disadvantage was that, you know, some of the older generals were very condescending, paternalistic. If I heard it once, I heard it a dozen times. You remind me of my daughter. And why aren't you covering refugees? Why aren't you writing about orphans? This is no place for a woman.
In March 1968, Kazikis was with the Marines at the besieged Khe Sanh combat base when it came under attack.
So I was wounded with a shrapnel from either a 130 millimeter or 152 millimeter round of artillery from North Vietnam, the other side of the DMZ.
Kazikis was medevaced out of Khe Sanh and flown to Da Nang, where she recovered. Catherine Leroy, the only woman photojournalist in Vietnam in 1968, suffered her own ordeal there. Shortly after the Tet Offensive, near the imperial city of Hue, Leroy was captured by the North Vietnamese. Speaking French to her captors, though, she managed to talk her way out of it and became the first news person to photograph the North Vietnamese behind enemy lines. Leroy's story made the cover of Life magazine in February 1968, and in a rare feat, she wrote the narrative that accompanied her photos, recounting her detention. As the war in Vietnam dragged on into the 1970s and the women's movement gained steam, more female journalists made their way there. And in the decades that followed, an ever-increasing number of women followed in their footsteps, covering and making history in hotspots across the globe.
I wish there were no more wars for us to cover, but that is never going to change, and that women have now their rightful place as professionals covering wars in all parts of the world. Reporting stories is extremely gratifying to see.
And women have continued to conquer on battlefields of their own since 1968, right here on American soil. "1968 was clearly a watershed year for women across America. But as our recent history has shown, there are still battles to be fought, demands to be made, and rights to be won. Still, it is likely because of what was achieved half a century ago that women today are able to stand together, addressing ever-new issues and injustices with a united voice. That'll do it for us today. I'm Carrie Sayers. As we leave, one last look at the women of 1968.